Coffee is in its infancy. It first appeared as a brewed beverage a mere 600 years ago, when tea and wine were already well established. The methods used to bring out coffee were exceedingly primitive. Only recently we have developed the technology to really produce a perfect cup. What is very interesting is that coffee and humans evolved kind of in the same place. Ethiopia. This is a map of Ethiopia. Here we can see the Great Rift Valley, the place where we humans come from. And here we can see where the plant of coffee evolved naturally in a species that today we call Arabica. Why do we call it Arabica if it evolved in Ethiopia? Hang on a second, we'll get there. Over time, Arabica coffee here in Ethiopia evolved naturally into thousands of varieties, and before any historical records, some people moved plants of coffee from their forest birthplace somewhere else, here. This is important because it shows how people were already drinking coffee, probably liking its properties, and therefore they wanted to move it closer to their homes to have it more often. And we should mark this event down because by doing that, by selecting and moving single plants out of their places of origin, we narrowed the genetic spectrum of these varieties. That is artificial selection, really. So, out of thousands of species of coffee naturally growing in Ethiopia, man selected a few and started cultivating them to very possibly make coffee. So now, let's zoom out. At one point, before the 15th century, somebody, probably Somali merchants from Berbera and Zeila, took coffee from Harar and the eastern Ethiopia and brought it across the Red Sea to Mocha, in modern-day Yemen. For years, Mocha was the capital of coffee, and because Europeans discovered coffee here from the Arabs, later they called this variety Arabica. That is the origin of the name. From Mocha, coffee made its way to North Africa and Egypt. The thriving trade between Venice, Egypt and the Middle East, back then the Ottoman Empire, brought coffee to the Venetian port. From Venice, it was introduced to the rest of Europe. Europeans and Arabs went crazy for this drink, and at some point, Mocha was super rich, as it was basically supplying all of Europe with coffee, but most of its clients were eager to get a piece of this pie. Coffee traders back then wanted to preserve their coffee monopoly. Any fertile seeds or living plants were not allowed to be exported out of the Arabian Peninsula. Competition became intense due to coffee's global popularity, but it was just a question of time, and eventually the race among Europeans to obtain live coffee trees was won by the Dutch in 1616. Yes, it is always the Dutch. Peter van der Broeke, a Dutch merchant, obtained some of the closely guarded coffee bushes and took them back to Amsterdam and found a home for them in the greenhouses of the botanical gardens, where they began to thrive. This probably looked like a minor event and received little publicity, but it turned out to have a major impact on the history of coffee. You see, according to many historians, coffee was the first commodity truly traded around the world, making globalization more than 350 years old. Moreover, the history of coffee is closely linked with the history of immigration and slavery. The cultivation of this plant has profoundly altered the environment in many places from Latin America, the Caribbean, and Southeast Asia. And we can say that this event was the beginning of all of this. But how did it get there? Well, in 1658, the beans that van der Broeke acquired from Mocha 40 years earlier adjusted well to conditions in the greenhouses of the Amsterdam Botanical Garden and produced numerous healthy Coffea arabica bushes. However, the climate in the Netherlands was not suitable for a large-scale coffee cultivation. Therefore, the Dutch, who at that time had colonies all around the world and wanted to be a producer of coffee and control this market and be super rich, took them to Ceylon, now Sri Lanka, and later in southern India to begin coffee cultivation. These first cultivations didn't work, so they abandoned them to focus on their third effort to make this crop work, their plantations on the island of Java. And the third time is usually the charm. So in 1711, the first exports of coffee were ready to be sent from Java to Europe by the Dutch East India Company. And just like that, Indonesia became the third place outside Arabia and Ethiopia where coffee was grown. Within a few years, the Dutch colonies had become the main supplier of coffee to Europe. And in this way, in the early 18th century, Amsterdam became the world's coffee capital, thanks to the coffee beans supplied from Java to Europe. The coffee trade was profitable and was under the control of the Dutch colonial government. Just to give you an idea, the coffee shipped from Java sold for 3 guilders per kilogram in Amsterdam. At that time, the average annual incomes in Holland were between 200 and 400 guilders. Therefore, do the math. Coffee was super expensive, the perfect gift for a king or something. A king like Louis XIV of France, for example.
Now comes one of the most extraordinary stories of the spread of coffee, the saga of the noble tree.
Louis XIV, with his insatiable curiosity and love of luxury, was of course by this time an ardent coffee drinker. In 1714, the Dutch owed him a favor and managed with great difficulty to procure him a coffee tree. The tree that was given to him had originally been obtained at the Arabian port of Mocha. It was taken to Java, and then finally, back across the seas, it arrived in Amsterdam, in Holland, and then overland to Paris for the kings to see. Louis is said to have spent an entire day alone communicating with a tree, probably thinking about all the money coffee was going to make for the royal coffers, before turning it over to his botanist. Sensing its importance, it was stored at the Royal Botanical Garden. It flowered, bore fruit, and became one of the most prolific parents in the history of plantdom. Let's step back for a second. We're talking about the Arabica species, which was taken from Mocha, then brought to Java, and then brought back to France. This plant, still known by the name of noble tree, can be considered the genetic parent of most of the existing coffee plants today. It was called Typica by botanists, using a Latin word that simply means ordinary. You can always recognize Typica plants. The early buds of these leaves, the first leaves that come out, are of a bronze color and have also a pointy, strangely graceful curl at the end of the leaves. Instead, the adult leaves are curled at the sides and have elongated tips. In its flavor, well, it's a typical coffee that tastes like coffee. In the flavor profile of Typica coffee, the notes of berries are in the foreground, whose fruity and fresh acids give life to a lively coffee with a low caffeine content. Coffee has a particularly sweet and fresh flavor. But France, it turns out, is not a great place to grow coffee outside greenhouses, as this plant really doesn't like frost. So the French took it elsewhere. So, 9 years after they arrived in France, the year was 1723, a guy named Gabriel de Clieux, a French naval officer and the governor of Guadeloupe, stole, borrowed a shoot of the coffee plant from the Royal Botanical Garden in Paris and took it across the Atlantic Ocean to Martinique, where he started a coffee plantation and became super rich. The story of his introduction of coffee in the Americas comes from his account of 1774, where he writes that during the voyage, the water was rationed and he had to share his water with the coffee plants. In reality, we do not know if he was the first to bring coffee to the New World. Some say it was the Dutch, but the point is that somehow, from Europe, the Typica was spread to Martinique and to the French colonies in the Indian Ocean. On the island of Réunion, which was still called Bourbon at that time, some French missionaries introduced Arabica plants directly from Yemen. Plants that, like the Typica of the noble tree, had not traveled all around the world as described before. These plants instead gave rise to another subvariant of Arabica on the island, Bourbon. Let's remember this name, Bourbon, because we'll be back later. Okay, let's talk about the Typica subvariants. And here the story starts to get complicated. Let's see. Martinique is the first coffee growing area in the Western Hemisphere. From there, it spread it to the French Guiana, which is here, and which turns out to be pretty close to Brazil. And Brazil is known for coffee, right? Yes. So how did he get there? At that time, Brazilians, or we should say the Portuguese, were looking for a cut of that sweet and profitable coffee market, which was in the hands of the Dutch and the French, but they could not obtain seeds from bordering French Guiana due to the governor's unwillingness to export the seeds, which is comprehensible. So what did they do? In 1727, they sent a guy named Francisco de Melo Paleta on a diplomatic mission to resolve an ordinary border dispute. On his way back home, he managed to smuggle the seeds into Brazil by seducing the governor's wife, who secretly gave him a bouquet spiked with seeds. So Paleta was able to bring the seeds of Typica in the state of Pará, in Brazil, from where they reached Rio de Janeiro in 1770. This is still the Typica of the noble tree in Paris, the same species that was taken from Mocha, brought to Java, and then back to Europe to eventually end up in Brazil. So let's pause for a second. The point here is that coffee went from being thousands of varieties in Ethiopia to being just fewer and fewer varieties as they moved around the world. And so, as we have it today, there are literally thousands of varieties still in Ethiopia, both in the wild and cultivated by people, whereas outside Ethiopia we only have a few dozens, and many of those are hybrids of the few varieties that we've been taking out of Ethiopia. Of these many thousand sub-varieties, most of them are mutation. To know more about one of the most important of them, we have to stay here in Brazil. In one place in Brazil, there was a town called Maragogipe in the state of Bahia, the birthplace of samba and Maragogipe coffee. And right here, in a very normal field of Typicas, an exceptional thing happened. In 1876, farmers realized that a new plant had emerged from a spontaneous mutation. A plant that was much larger leaves, larger trunk, even the fruits themselves were bigger. And the bean was huge enough to be called the elephant bean. This fact was obviously very interesting for the owners of the field, so they selected the mutation and kept it separate from the rest, and then started planting the seeds. The Maragogipe is in fact a recognized sub-variety within the Typica family that has undergone a natural mutation, a demonstration of the power of nature to continually evolve and renew itself. It's poetry. Okay, but how does it taste? Well, the flavor of Maragogipe coffee is very interesting. In general, it has a very low caffeine content and good acidity, but it must be said that its main characteristic is that it varies a lot depending on the soil where it grows. Obviously, poor soils produce a coffee with diminished flavor, but the flavor can be enhanced by allowing these coffee beans to dry with its own natural sugars. Furthermore, if grown at altitude, this coffee has a very high potential. Maragogipe is a rarity in the coffee world, and it's really appreciated by coffee aficionados. The Maragogipe was successful, and it spread, always in small productions, also in other coffee-producing countries, while continuing to be called with the name of the small Brazilian town. Many Typica plants took the traditional name of the place where they were first grown, and even if they are still from the Arabica branch, they can actually vary in their aromatic profile due to the peculiarity of the place, the climate, the soil, and the processing methods used. For example, the renowned Jamaica Blue Mountain is a coffee from the Typica sub-variety, which is grown in the Blue Mountains of Jamaica. It was introduced there pretty early, in 1728. Here, the climate of the region is cool and misty, with high rainfall. Let's remember that Arabica is a plant that evolved under the canopy of tropical forests, and therefore prefers shade. Here, the soil is also rich, with excellent drainage. This combination of climate and soil is considered ideal for coffee. So much so that the best lots of Blue Mountain coffee are noted for their mild flavor and their lack of bitterness. Over the last few decades, this coffee had developed a reputation that has made it one of the most sought after and expensive coffee in the world. Another very expensive coffee of the Arabica sub-branch is the Kona coffee from Hawaii. It was introduced there in 1828, and it turned out that the weather along the slopes of Hualalai and Mauna Loa was very good for growing coffee. Sunny mornings, cloud or rain in the afternoon, little wind and mild nights, combined with porous mineral-rich volcanic soil create a coffee with an unique flavor profile, a mixture of brown sugar, milk chocolate, a touch of honey, and a hint of sharp fruit flavor.
Because Typica had emerged so early as a sort of ordinary coffee, it was planted all around the world and has taken on different names and different taste profiles according to the climate and the terroir.
Pluma Hidalgo, San Ramon, San Bernardo, Burgundal, Kent, Chikumalgur, Jamaica Blue Mountain, and Kona. As we have seen before, the other place where Arabica was planted by the French was the Bourbon Island, now called Réunion, in the Indian Ocean. Typica, as we have seen, is the variety that was brought by the Dutch from Yemen to Indonesia, and then to Amsterdam, and then given to the French. Bourbon, on the other hand, derives directly from the Arabica of Yemen, as it was brought to this island by French missionaries in the early 1700s. Here, this plant, for some reason, underwent a profound mutation, giving rise to a variety of Arabica in its own right, that today we call Bourbon. Young leaves are green in color, and mature leaves are generally larger than typical leaves. Another peculiarity of this variety is the yellow or orange color of its ripe fruit, in addition to the traditional red color.
One thing about Bourbon is that its flavor profile maintains a very sweet and rich characteristic. The sweetness is actually what is most associated with Bourbon. The largest number of prize-winning coffees over the last few decades, it was of the Bourbon strain. And if you ask most of coffee buyers, they'll talk about Bourbon in a very poetic way.
Bourbon grows best at heights between 1,100 and 2,000 meters and gives a 20-30% higher yield than Typica, but produces a similar quality of coffee. Because it was very productive, from the island of Réunion, it was brought to other parts of the world, such as Brazil, Central America, Guatemala, and up to El Salvador. In one of these new Bourbon plantations, in 1935, here we go again, one individual emerged that was very different from the others. Yes, again it was a mutation, and again it took place in Brazil. This variant was called Caturra, a word which in the Guarani language means small. It was later discovered that this mutation involved only one gene that caused a phenomenon called dwarfism. But the new plant was much more productive because, being smaller, more trees could be planted using the available soil better. And furthermore, precisely because it was lower, the fruits were also easier to harvest. Therefore, farmers were understandably very attracted to this new sub-variety right away.
For all these reasons, it's very common in Latin America, and today is one of the most widespread varieties in the world.
Caturra produced a cup quality that was not excellent, above all due to the intensity of the cultivation and the exploitation of the land. Other Bourbons that we see out there are French Mission, Pacas, Yellow Bourbon, and Orange Bourbon. So let's look at this image for a second. We've got the varieties Typica and Bourbon, and all the little sub-varieties of them. In 1927, on the island of Timor in Indonesia, a very unusual thing happened, which is rarely seen in nature: the crossing of two species. There was a field that was growing both some Arabica Typica planted in 1917 and some trees of a different coffee species that we call Robusta, which we'll be talking about extensively later. We were saying that here in Timor something very strange happened. These two species mated. Yes, they did. Normally in biology species don't mate with each other and don't produce offspring. But in this case, for some reason which are still unclear to science, it emerged an individual that had clear characteristics of both Robusta and the Arabica Typica that was growing there. In other words, these two species produced what's called an interspecific hybrid, which is a hybrid of the two species. It's a very unusual phenomenon, and it hasn't happened in the wild since. This was called the Timor hybrid. Some people call it Arabusta, from Arabica and Robusta. So this variety in the 40s became very popular for planting because it had the disease resistance disease-resistant characteristics of Robusta, and it had some of the good flavor characteristics of the Arabica. Timor hybrid quickly spread throughout the coffee industry, so by the 50s and the 60s there were a lot of Timor hybrids out there. Unfortunately, this event was accompanied by a general decline of the quality of coffee, whose effects we saw in the subsequent decades. It became apparent that there were several problems with the Timor hybrid, specifically related with taste, and so it was decided to cross it with another plant that was very highly productive. Remember before when we were talking about Caturra? So we've got the high productivity Caturra and the disease-resistant Timor hybrid. They were put together, they did their thing, and we got a very productive and disease-resistant hybrid. And that variety was a mixture of Caturra and Timor and was called Timor. Timor was planted all over the world in the 60s because it looked too good to be true. It had the disease resistance property of Timor and it was highly productive, just like Caturra. The downside was that it still had those flavor notes coming from the Robusta, and for the people that were looking for the acidity of Arabica, that was a problem. So hybridizing coffee happened very early on, as soon as it became apparent to farmers that there were different varieties and that they had different characteristics. A place where this happened was precisely Brazil, where they crossed the Typica arrived, as we have seen, from the original strain with the new, more productive variants of Bourbon. This new hybrid was called Mundo Novo, a word that means new world. In 1943, the seeds of the original coffee plants were planted in the municipality of Mundo Novo, a small town which today is called Urupês. Mundo Novo is a plant that is characterized by its very tall stature. It is vigorous and productive, but matures late. Its leaf tips can be green or bronze. It is commercially very important in Brazil, but in other countries, such as Colombia, it has not been very successful because farmers thought it was too tall and therefore difficult to grow. Mundo Novo was followed by other hybrids such as Catuai, Maracatu and Maracaturra. You might tell from the names which varieties were crossed. But among all these hybrids, there's one that had a very different, very particular story. You see, in Africa there was a variety called Tanganyika drought resistant, and this was crossed with another one called Sudanrini. And this hybrid got the name SL28 out of an assessment of coffee in the 20s done by the Scott Agricultural Laboratories, who just assigned it the number 28. That is where the names come from. The Scott Labs were established by the colonial British government in Kenya. SL28 is probably, for coffee aficionados and buyers, one of the most cherished of the coffee varieties. SL28 is also notable for its rusticity, a quality meaning that it can be left unattended for years or even decades and return to successful production. Alright, that is Arabica, which is about 60% of the coffee produced and sold around the world. But what about the other 40%? Well, 2% is Liberica, grown in Central Africa, and due to the limited supply, Liberica beans are very expensive. Okay, but the remaining 38%? Do you remember we were talking about the other branch, the Robusta? We named it when we were talking about the Timor hybrid. Well, it turns out that Robusta is a super important variety of coffee and it would need a video on its own. Robusta originated in Ivory Coast and in the Central African republics, which are warmer and wetter compared to Ethiopia. The plant is scientifically identified as Coffea canephora, and its beans tend to have lower acidity, more bitterness, and a more woody and less fruity flavor compared to Arabica. Arabica grows best with low temperatures of 15 degrees and high temperatures of 25 degrees. Robusta grows better in warmer temperatures, 24 to 30 degrees. The Robusta plant has a greater crop yield than that of Arabica. It is easier to grow and it is less susceptible to disease than Arabica. For all these reasons, it has always been considered of a lower quality compared to Arabica. That was in part due to its flavor. Less acidic, more bitter, but also it was due to the fact that with the same effort, farmers could have grown more. Therefore, Robusta has always been grown and sold as cheaper coffee or used primarily as instant coffee. The truth is that it contains more caffeine, 2.7%, compared to Arabica's 1.5%, and contains less sugar, 3 to 7%, compared to Arabica's 6 to 9%. That's it, that's the end of the video, right? Well, no, after all these tropical countries, let's talk about Italy, for example. In Italy, a new way of brewing coffee was developed at the beginning of the 20th century. This way of making coffee was called espresso. Slowly but steadily, this Italian coffee culture spread around the world.
But what does this have to do with the Robusta? Well, you see, in Naples and in south of Italy, for example, the full-bodied flavor of Robusta in a blend is considered very desirable to give more finish and strength to the taste.
In northern Italy, this tends not to be the case. Arabica has always been preferred. Also, Robusta blends tend to be much more creamy and less acidic. And today, there are a lot of people out there that are not crazy or do not tolerate the acidic taste of Arabica.
So yeah, also Robusta has a very important place in the history of coffee. If you want to know more about Naples and its way of drinking coffee, take a look at this video from Stefano. That's all. That was our video on coffee variants. It's been a huge work for us. I hope you liked it. If you did, leave us a like, comment here below, and subscribe to our channel. From Naples, happy coffee to everybody, and goodbye.